network scoping proposal from last week. And hopefully everybody had enough time to read it, understand it, and there are plenty of questions to cover the full rest of the hour we have. So, Louis, would you like maybe to talk more about the updates? Like, are there some main takeaways, or would you like to get questions?
Just give me 2 seconds. Yeah, so I can go through the updates. I tried to summarize, create a section at the bottom of the doc to just summarize the general nature of the updates. Obviously there was, I think there are a few important general topics that came up in the last meeting. Like one was the point Spike raised about separating this from the notion of the RBAC policies more clearly. While there's still some bike shedding about naming going on, hopefully we'll come to some reasonable resolution about that in the short term. Maybe it's not the best use of the meeting's time to bike shed on the names. But I did update in the document, I renamed the resource to network scope just to make it a little clearer, although I don't think that's going to be the final name. Then there were a bunch of questions about how global defaults would work. And there's this somewhat existential question about, do we follow a paradigm of, electing a special namespace for the global defaults? Or do we create equivalent schemas in CRDs for cluster scope CRDs and have those be the global defaults? The downside of doing that is we have 2 CRDs and the potential for those things to vary. And one of the more meta points was we should be very careful when designing any of our resources that intend to have global admin defaults, that there needs to be a good reason for them to have a different schema than the namespace level ones. And we're not consistent about that in the project right now.
If I can jump in on these topics slightly in the environment meetings, and I made a proposal and we discussed a bit having profiles, basically having in the same cluster, having different parallel installations of Istio with different versions, with Canary version, production version, and maybe small variants, and each of them creating kind of sort of having its own defaults, basically. So you will not have a cluster defaults, but you will have a default per profile. So you can have developer profile, have different settings than production profiles.
And you can use namespaces to manage
and that. You could use namespaces, and the way it would work is that you point to the sidecar injector namespace, because sidecar injector is kind of the one controlling how you are configuring your stuff, and then based on the profile, you get a set of telemetry servers, pilot servers, and probably defaults in different aspects. So that will kind of conflict with having global cluster resources, basically.
Yes, it would. Yeah, cluster. These kind of very fixed globals that cluster resources would represent
if we can avoid them,
seem problematic in the long run. And so while it's something we've done elsewhere in other parts of the config, I was chatting with Martin and some folks in the config working group, maybe we should document this as policy to say, look, we should not vary the schemas unless there's a good reason to. We should treat namespaces as if they were a pseudo hierarchy, at least a 2-level one to begin with.
Yep.
And that should make the APIs more conceptually similar. The other thing, and Martin brought this up in one of the comments, and it's pretty reasonable, is that most of the defaults, if the resources are designed to be merged, then the job of applying a default is just doing a sensible merge, right? And so there's a question here about what should MCP do? All right, so let's say we had a cluster, a namespace which represents the defaults. Is our expectation that Galley would do the merge and deliver the merged resource to the runtime components so they didn't have to worry about it? Or is that insufficient, right? Because we could have more than one MCP thing talking to Pilot, and Pilot would still end up having to do merging. most of the time, the things we expect Pilot to be merging are merged as union, are not prioritized merges, like service entries, service discovery. Yes. Or you have something that's a replacement for Pilot, like more like the Cloud Foundry situation, I think, which could have also done the merging too. So I think I agree with Martin that it's okay for Galley to do the merge, yeah, and for this feature to basically be a Galley-only feature, right? That if we want to have a admin namespace, then you say to Galley what the admin namespace is, and when people make changes there or to other resources, it takes care of the merge semantics for the particular resource type. That certainly keeps the implementation a little simpler.
Does that include things like the virtual service merging, the concatenation that's in Pilot today?
No, so it only, yeah, I think we would only, because we still merge virtual services across namespaces, I don't think Galley would be able to implement the spec that's defined in this resource.
So I don't necessarily then buy that Galley is the cleaner place to implement it, because we're still going to have, so it's still merging, right? It's a little bit different semantics.
Wait a minute, which merging of virtual service are you referring to here?
So in this document, and one of the things I was going to get to later is how virtual service should be processed, right, in a namespace that's referring to virtual services in other namespaces. Right, and what I said in the document was that the virtual service declaration in this namespace takes precedence over the others, and the others are merged in import order. Right, which is in many ways a simplification of what we were describing as the other merging semantics of virtual service. It's very deterministic.
My understanding was that with this proposal in place, when you start using enabling network scope, you will stop seeing other namespaces unless you import them explicitly.
Right, so but you can still import n virtual services for the same host. Right.
Or it doesn't even address the ingress use case that actually originally motivated the merge.
No, but ingress is now changed. I mean, if you look at the ingress part or the gateway part,
right,
it's now the other way around. I mean, the gateway is specifying where it delegates and is no longer a undeterministic merging. It's a very deterministic.
Right, so that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. So,
but for that we have a different solution. So
right. So why is that? So why is that merging different from merging defaults? Right.
Right. That's my point. There is a question here, right? In theory, this specification would allow Galley to do the merging, right? The only reason for Galley to do it is because you are going to be delivering to a Pilot per namespace, right?
Yep.
So the problem is Pilot has a global, right? Typically, we treat Pilot as a global controller, right? And I think we're going to stick with that. I don't think that would be a big architectural change.
How would it even do that? Because in reality, when someone connects to Pilot, you need to deliver a configuration that is from the perspective of that particular. So Galley
if you ran a Pilot in each namespace, then Galley could
do that.
Right. I think that's the point, right?
So Galley will need to send for each namespace a different set of configs.
Right. So I think part of it, Zach, is how complicated are the merge semantics, and at what scale do they need to be done? So the electing a namespace as the default admin namespace does seem like a concern Galley could take on, because the scale is smaller and the domain required knowledge is less, right? It's not a lot of code.
Yeah, I mean, so I generally agree, right? I think it's pretty reasonable to have Galley do these defaults. I just think it's hard to explain to somebody how this actually works, right? Because some of the merging happens here, some of it happens there.
I think I have a way to explain it that would make sense, and I think so. We can say, hey, by default, each namespace is completely isolated from all the others. There is no default. You have a consistent and clear configuration in each namespace. Galley just happens to be able to generate this configuration that is specific for a namespace through some other mechanism that involve merging defaults, administrative, whatever overrides. But in the end, you can say dump all the configuration for my namespace, and you'll get a set of YAML that is a complete set and deterministic set of everything that applies to that namespace.
Right. So basically, we're saying that the ability to enable a namespace as an admin level default for a bunch of domain artifacts is a Galley-only feature. And absent that, everything is namespace isolated.
Yep. And Galley may combine this so from other sources. I mean, have a UI or something that is integrated with Galley. I mean, it doesn't necessarily put any constraint on how the config for a namespace is configured. Just that in the end, pilot will get for each namespace a set of configs, and that config will be the source of truth, and you can dump it and ration about it, or not use Gali, use something else, but still have some merging and takes this output and as configuration.
Right. So I mean, basically, we're saying that this type of merging it's like a CI/CD concern.
Yep.
But we're giving you a basic level of support for that built into the tool, and that's only built into the config processing tool, not built into the runtime.
Actually, that's even better. You can use CI/CD to generate a config.
Right. So the point was there are basically three options.
Yeah.
Right. It's we do ad hoc cluster-wide defaults, right, which was what we've been doing today.
Yeah.
We say, no, we're not going to do that, but we're going to provide some basic support in Galley. Or no, we're not going to do that. Go do it in your CI/CD tool. Right?
Yep. Yeah. No, so like I said, right, I think Galley is a very reasonable place to do it. I just want to know I just want us to be cognizant of, we have merging that does happen in multiple places.
Yeah. To me, it doesn't look like the right place because Gala is not meant to implement networking functionality.
But
If this model would be general and you can define something that would apply to any config, yes, maybe that the place would be Gala. So we would have very clear semantics for any config.
Right, so
but
how would
since this is very networking specific,
how would a CI/CD system do this?
Is that the rhetorical question?
No.
Right. So for like default access policies or something like that, any CI/CD system that's going to provide a hierarchical merge of policies to enable admin level defaults is going to do the same thing.
So why would it be in the CI/CD system? So to me,
Because
this
that's
is
the only-
this is a very networking specific behavior.
Andrea, can I interrupt you for a second?
go in that pilot, right?
The plan, my understanding of the plan, and I think there is a confusion here. Once we enable network scope, everything, all the policy security, RBAC, everything will follow the per namespace paradigm. So this is not only about importing virtual services. It's complete isolation of namespaces when we enable it, because that's what we're trying to solve. We're trying to
That's my question. Like, is this something that applies in general?
Yes,
right?
yes, it does.
The plan is to apply to
No,
it's called
it's not called namespace scoping, and it doesn't do separation based on namespace.
Forget about the name.
At least from the name of the.
Forget about the name.
Right.
In order for this feature to be useful, it needs to separate completely everything that we define as in policy, security, environment.
Okay,
whatever.
sure. If that is the case, then it should be presented as a more general.
Well, that's why I brought the discussion up. I said
Feature,
the thread was
Yeah.
about a general feature.
Right, exactly, and that should apply to any config that I
Right.
define,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
not
Absolutely.
necessarily to
Right.
virtual
So
services.
very
or
clearly, we
something.
have this for
Right.
this. We have this for RBAC policies, right? And we probably have it for some of the mesh-wide defaults. We certainly have, like, Mixer's already doing this. Like, just as well.
Okay, are they doing it exactly like that?
Yes.
Okay, so
Similarly
then
enough.
we should have a common document that
Right. So
applies
that
to each.
that was the point.
Mhm.
But that should be owned by the the config working
Mhm.
group. But we still have to make an architectural decision because it affects this feature. And we need to decide how we want to make progress.
Right, and frankly, I think there'll be a lot of confusion about, just as Zach said, about what gets merged where.
So nothing in this version nowhere. I mean, it's basically from the point of view of pilot and Istio or whatever, we have per namespace a set of configurations.
Yes.
And Galley may happen to generate the configurations from whatever sources they please. It's not our problem, and Galley is owning configuration. As long as each namespace gets a config, we are happy.
Right. So the goal is to deliver for each namespace a complete config.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And if you dump it to a file, you'll see you can understand what's going on independent of the rest of the world.
Right,
Basically.
yeah, if we present it like that, it starts to make sense.
Right. So it came up in the context of this doc because I had to write something about admin defaults because it is a present concern.
Yeah.
And I did have the chat with Martin, which is why this came up. So it's an important issue. If we all agree in principle that we don't want to create custom CRDs, we want to have an admin namespace, and we want Galley to act like a lightweight, basically like a lightweight CD tool for a very small subset of capabilities where we arbitrarily define the merging semantics of each type. We precisely define them, right? So it's either ordered concatenation, it's union merge, right? Those are really the only two viable ones, right? To have sensible merging semantics. Then is this type mergeable, right? Is a question. And hopefully being careful enough to make sure that it is.
Yeah.
And then what other types would that need to apply to? And very clearly RBAC, right? Because that's one thing that people very much want control over. It will also apply, by the way, to network filters or any customized envoy behaviors that admins want absolute control over, right?
And short term, I think for the next release, we can very well live with the model where, hey, when you enable this feature, you just put everything in each namespace and deal with that later.
So the one thing I called out in this document was that the global default stuff doesn't need to be implemented in the first cut.
Okay.
Right? As long as the admin is willing to fully write the specification in the namespace, it will meet their requirements.
The global default is the first thing that most people would use. I mean, that's what we learned when we did all the stuff, right? Like people were like complaining that.
No, but Sriram, most of this is to scope the visible network to a specific namespace's use case. A global default isn't useful in that context.
Define the global default here. Is it more like one flag thing, or is it more like a resource thing?
The global default is a common set of services that we expect every namespace to consume.
Well, but that is same as putting all the stuff in one namespace and then importing that namespace in all the configurations, right?
Yeah.
This is like the egress use case, but no, but in my mind, global default is there's a global network scope object which defines like import A, B, and C and D, and here are the X, Y, and Z, and that basically gets inherited by everybody, and they add their stuff on top of it.
Right, that's what that means, right? So the short-term workaround for that is everybody goes and imports those things explicitly.
We copy that resource in each namespace.
But then that is my point being that is where things just start breaking, because I mean, sure, we can do that as long as we say by default everything is open for all.
Right. Well, that's already the default, right? We can't go
but then
and break people.
Then if we want to do something like not open for all, but everybody basically gets to do only local namespace access, only global default, then it effectively means everybody let's take the Marius example, right? They have like 6,000 services across thousands of namespaces, and they have to go and generate this for each and every namespace that's going to come or that has existed. And that basically breaks the whole point of doing this pruning immediately.
No. I mean, the upgrade transition plan is by default, if you don't have this resource in your namespace, right, subject to a flag, you import everything, right, which is the behavior today.
Mm-hmm.
If you add this resource, then you are saying that I want to downscope my visible network, and I don't have any implicit imports, right? Everything is explicit.
This is the same as the Kubernetes network.
But how do you basically say it's only like namespace local only and not,
by creating the resource in the namespace.
So
without any configuration?
No. If you create the resource, you're going to add all your imports to it.
Or now import if you don't import anything. So if
you can do import star. It's allowed in the API right now.
Or import nothing, and that means that you are not importing anything. You're just.
And you'll probably break, right?
No, you'll not break. I mean, if you're not using any other resource, you're fine.
Well, if you do,
if you're only talking to services already in your namespace,
then
you're fine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But if you do import nothing, and if you specify that as the built-in semantics, and then you have this global flag which says by default everybody can talk to everybody else, then what does this actually mean?
Well,
so you're saying by default, right? By creating the resource, you're saying I don't want the default.
So there are two levels of settings here. I mean, one level of setting is when you upgrade from Istio 1.0 to whatever this will be. You keep the existing, nothing breaks. You keep the existing behavior. You start migrating namespace by namespace. And at some point, when all the namespaces have been migrated and have a network scope, you change the default, you upgrade Istio and specify, hey, I want cluster-wide to have isolation.
Right.
And at that point, any new namespace will have to put a network scoper. By default, will have a network.
What
happens? What about existing namespace?
No, existing will. I mean, you will start upgrading to Istio 1.1, which has this capability. Let's say. You go by on each namespace and you put a network scope and you configure it and migrate. So gradually add network scope. And when you finish with all namespaces and you verify that each namespace has a network scope, you can turn the default, and for new namespaces, you'll
Right. So there's two features here, right? There's an Istio-wide flag that says either namespaces are isolated by default, right, or they're importing everything by default, right? If you go and in the
right, so it's import everything by default when they upgrade to
Of course.
yes, of course,
right.
because that's
So,
the current behavior.
yeah, so I think the question is, what if they have two namespaces, they are happy, now they want to switch the global flag? How does that impact their existing
Well, they should
namespace?
create network scopes in each namespace before switching the global flag.
Oh, so that's mandatory.
So my point is this: like we thought of this exact same model when we designed the first set of the API things, but then the moment it immediately broke was when we had to do things like this Knative stuff, where they were dynamically creating objects, namespaces, and adding services and so on. So it actually adds additional overhead to them to basically say you have to also author Istio level stuff for every namespace that you actually create, where you put in the namespace level scope. But instead, if we actually have some configuration, which is the global network, the scoping thing, which allows things like Knative to define it.
So Shriyam, I mean, when it comes to Knative, right?
That's an example. I mean, that
right, but I mean, you're either going to like the Knative stuff is going to be created in a namespace, right? So if you want to say, I want to take dependency on every function that could be created in that namespace, you'll import star from that namespace.
No. I'm not talking about how to define it. What I'm saying is, management wise, if I have a system like something like Knative, which is creating a namespace, dumping a bunch of things, and then deleting the namespace, all done programmatically in response to some user event and so on, then in that case, what we're doing here by saying that we will not have a global network scope that everybody else would inherit from, but that we only have two like high level flags, which is like
Right, but I mean that's a tenuous use case, right? I mean, a global set of functions that are dynamically created that we expect everybody to use on the fly in every namespace, that doesn't really hold water.
No, hold on. I think I'm not done yet. What I'm saying is that if you imagine a system that is creating a dynamic namespace and then dumping a bunch of workloads, and then they do their stuff, and then the namespace gets deleted. And so let's say these workloads all have across all sort of dynamically created namespaces, they all have a common set of dependencies. They all depend on some fixed set of namespaces that are pre-created, that are already existing, and that are there, right? And so now by default, what we're doing with this model that we have today, they can't simply set a global namespace only by default setting. They don't want to set a global star by default setting, because that's too much overhead. What they want is like, hey, I have this network scope project that everybody is basically going to inherit, and I just define it one time when I first deploy my controller in the system, and then the controller can create a namespace, and boom, by default, the moment I create a namespace programmatically, it inherits this network scope.
Right, so what you're talking about there is an infrastructural import, right, which I cover in the document, right?
Yeah.
The debate is whether we block delivery of this feature on the global default being present or not.
My point being that is the global default for that is basically what most people will tend to use at first cut.
Well, I mean, when I've talked to a decent number of people, there are a lot of people who won't, right? So dynamically created namespaces on the fly, right?
That's an example.
But I mean, that's the important thing, right? Because what you're saying is there's a large fleet of relatively static namespaces that are consuming services, right? And they're going to want to consume those other namespaces that are created on the fly, but without a priori knowledge.
No, it's the other way around. You have a small set of pre-created namespaces with, let's say, like some services, some external service proxies, and I don't know, whatever, some cloud foundry stuff or some your own stuff, and then you're dynamically creating namespaces for one or more.
Okay, but like, how much work is it for those kind of systems that create namespaces on the fly to create a network scope resource?
It is a lot of work if you imagine. We did the same thing with Let's Encrypt, right? We thought like, hey, how much work is it for you to simply create an Istio gateway resource, and why do you have to bother with Istio ingress resource? And then we bent head over heels to fix that Let's Encrypt stuff and support them by merging gateways and doing all.
Knative is radically different than Let's Encrypt, right? We were having trouble getting Let's Encrypt to agree to create gateway resources.
But that's the same thing will happen with.
No, it's not the same thing, because they treat Istio as an infrastructural dependency, right? Let's Encrypt viewed Istio as a thing that happened to work in Kubernetes ecosystem that they didn't feel super motivated to align with.
but my point that like there'll be other systems in future that'll have similar things, and or there
Right,
are.
no, Sriram, I'm only saying that, do we hold up delivery of this feature based on the global default, or would we rather ship the ability to do this sooner and add the default later? I'm not saying we don't do the default.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a useful increment to ship it even without the default. I mean, I don't think anyone's arguing with you that the default is a good idea, Sriram.
Right. The other thing to remember, Sriram, is with the upgraded behavior, if you don't create a network scope resource in the namespace, it's import all, which is the current behavior.
That part, I'm not worried about that part. I think my point was like I was thinking of these guys like Amadeus and so on, where to them having that globally shared network scope would be immensely helpful because they would define it once, and like this is what that guy David.
I think everybody agrees that there's utility there, right?
Yeah.
But if the intermediate step is, if you create a namespace, you get the current default behavior, which is import everything, then you're not broken. You don't have to do any additional work until you want to.
But like those guys, their Istio adoption is blocked because of the scale issue, and for them, this is actually a one-shot configuration.
Right. So I'm just saying, can we deliver something to them sooner, and they can decide if they want to adopt it?
Because this global implies solving problem of merging and other stuff, and Gali could solve them, of course, but I don't know if Gali will solve it right.
When there's an order of delivery problem.
It can be done fast and not clear if it's going to be as we want it.
Agree on having a globally like a predetermined namespace like Istio system, and if we say that anything that's in Istio system will get inherited, like all the network scope objects in Istio system will get inherited to everybody else, and that alone will just solve the problem. It's same.
Right, I want to decouple those two decisions, right? I think we can get the community to agree on some defaulting mechanism, right, that is consistent across all the APIs, but it has to be consistent across all the APIs. And then there's the feature.
How about a middle ground where we have a system, but with restrictions that we are not doing merging? We're just doing overrides, because that's
the merging is very easy. It's just concatenating the two arrays. There is no
concatenation. Yes,
that's a merge.
That's all we need to do. But like
it's very clear when I said what merging.
Concatenation and merge are slightly different.
No, there's only three types of merge, right? The prepend, postpend, and union.
Yeah.
Which one is it?
It's
gateway merging is
small.
more intertwining.
That's gateway merging. This merging is very easy. It's just two arrays that we have to like concatenate.
Right. So with Sriram we can do it. I'm just saying we have to get all the other working groups to agree to that config paradigm.
That part is going to be difficult, right? Because they have cluster scoped and object scoped. And
well, no, I actually don't think it's going to be that hard, but it's not going to happen in this meeting.
Yeah, fair point. That's true.
So are we all agreed that we can then press on with this and get merging after we get consensus then?
I think that makes sense, right? And
yeah.
So I would actually like to hear if other people on the line have anything to say.
I mean, don't we already need some merging though?
We do a lot of merging.
Niraj, would you like to say something?
Yes. Let me mute the other thing. Yeah. All right. So I've been looking at the document, and I rather looked at it late. It feels like it's trying to achieve a lot of things. It's just from a configuration point of view, if you're an operator, it still feels you have to look at a lot of resources to understand what's going on. Can
you be a bit more specific or provide an example?
Functionality that we are adding, the complexity of configuration is still, it feels a lot to me.
You mean adding the imports or which one? Which part is?
If anyone else also shared the same feedback.
So I think we're going to need a little bit more specific feedback to like have an actionable discussion.
Sorry, Louis, I missed that. Can you say that again?
Can you be a bit more specific?
Yes. So basically, what I'm looking at is the import semantics, where I look at a network scope. I have to first figure out the other namespaces, what hosts they are exporting. Then I need to import them. Then to understand what the virtual services are doing, I'll have to still go to virtual services resources and see what kind of routing they are doing, right? There are at least 3 to 4 resources every time I have to look
Well, I would actually, one, virtual services are already merged today. So if you own a gateway that is binding multiple virtual services, right, you're responsible for understanding what they do, or you choose not to import them, right? And you have a monolithic virtual service which you completely own and define as a unit. You get that choice, right? And that's an important property of this design, which is distinctly different from before, right? I can choose not to import anything, right? And create a virtual service for a hostname that's defined elsewhere, and I have arbitrary control over it. If I choose to import n virtual services from n different namespaces, then they need to merge. And understanding of that merge is my responsibility because I chose to import them. Or to put it another way, what I really did as a gateway owner is I chose to delegate to n different namespaces responsibility for partial ownership of the host. Right, which is why I pinged you about the traffic ownership stuff, because it achieves the same net effect at a slightly different granularity. But either way, right, if people want absolute control, they have the ability to achieve it, which they don't have today. And if they are merging because they've delegated ownership, then that's something that they have to do again today already. So either way, this is strictly both more expressive, but also no more complicated.
Yes, I mean, I think I'm following what you're saying. I still need to digest the document more, to be honest, to have a better understanding. But just that was my...
And then just coming back specifically on virtual services, for people who know, what I say is the order of merge is, if you define a virtual service in that namespace, the merge order is that virtual service declaration is prepended to ones that are outside the namespace. This is extremely useful for things like Let's Encrypt, right? Where I, as the gateway owner, can basically attach common behavior to everything that's bound to my gateway with path-based selection and have a deterministic merge where the other namespaces cannot override that behavior, right? Which is precisely the thing we wanted for Let's Encrypt that we weren't able to do before.
I see. So if the virtual services in two namespaces have the same host names, and in one namespace I am importing the other one, then you will prepend first the local rules and then import the rules from the other namespace.
Yes.
I see.
Would it be possible for us to actually show the user the actual merged results so they don't have to, at least they can calculate and compare what's going to be active in the system?
Sure. I mean, like we have tried to do that before with many different APIs, right? We don't have a command line tool per se anymore, right? So the best way to do this would probably be to query pilot.
Yeah.
But if Gale has it, then...
Well, if Gale's not doing the merge for everything.
It's just
all we're saying is
providing all
Gale's
the
doing
results.
this, right?
Yeah, because I share Nina's concern. I mean, it's actually hard to figure out what exactly is going to be applied, and who is going to provide a particular gateway resource and what are virtual services, all that too.
I would argue that part of our goal should be that you don't have to, right? Like if we think about a consumer, there's some service that's published in another namespace that I want to consume. I really shouldn't have to think about their virtual service or a lot of that configuration, right? Like that's the normal case, right? Somebody is publishing a service, they describe how to contact it. I import that host name or I import that namespace. Right,
well,
that's the usual
because
case.
What if I want to control my dark launch or canary testing? You know, I want to know exactly what's being applied.
Right. So the service provider will control the virtual service that does the canary to my service, and consumers of my service should never see that. Right? Like they shouldn't have to care about that. So that's I guess that's my problem with. Like, yes, you're importing in stuff and if you want to understand what it's doing, you have to go look at it. There's no way to get around that. But most of the time, you shouldn't have to care what that stuff is because you're consuming some host name, some service.
Yeah, but what if you don't trust completely?
Well, to take an example, googleapis.com. When you go to googleapis.com, you don't know if you're going to a canary or not. You don't understand how it's routed, but it works.
Precisely.
Oh, that's because you trust it. When you don't trust it.
Then if you
single trust, then
if you don't trust the service run by another namespace, right? you have an option, right, which is to go bypass that, right, create your own service entry for the same name, figure out what endpoints it's supposed to have, figure out what network policy it's supposed to have, and don't import the other thing and use it, right?
Right,
so in the
be,
previous model, you weren't able to override.
That's true. I agree. Yeah, it's just you have definitely more control with this new model. It's just the level configuration, the complexity certainly increases. So it's going to be a little bit harder for user to actually know if that configuration is actually what they wanted to config.
Well, to be clear, right, what Zach described, right, where you import a service from another namespace and you don't do anything else other than that, is the overwhelming majority of cases.
Well, that's the external service, but if you think about
internal too.
Well,
right,
internal, when your services are under development, I mean, you're not going to route all your traffic.
You're not running the other service, right? I'm a namespace. I create a Kubernetes service. It's called sales. Your inventory, and you call it. You have no control over my definition of sales.
The fundamental assumption of interaction between teams responsible for microservices is that dependent service is opaque.
Yeah, generally
the consumer is not responsible for any traffic management to the providing service.
And if you want an override to the behavior, you probably go ask the service producer to create a special version for you, which is what subsetting is for.
Now, we discussed.
Okay, so you guys don't see the concern of consumer actually control.
I think it's a massively minority case, and if the consumer was that paranoid, right? Because that's like an enormous level of paranoid. It's like, why am I even talking to the thing if I don't trust it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think in terms of consumption, the delegation model and this are the same. Like you have to trust what you're delegating to or what you're supporting. So I agree there. It's just still the new level of configuration that we are asking people to do.
Right, so we're only asking people to do this one if you are concerned about your scale. Yeah. And if you're that paranoid about workloads running in your namespaces that you think will egress to things that you don't want them to be able to egress to, which is a concern for some companies, right? It's an egress firewall declared at layer 7.
So Louis, can we actually say from what scale we start to recommend this?
Right now, probably if you're north of 500 services, you probably already care about this.
Okay. But like anything beyond that is okay. Like there'll be many companies with fewer than 500 services, right?
Well, they should also probably for sanity because right now the problem that many people complain about the fact that it's unpredictable. You don't know if you have multiple namespaces and multiple team working, you already cannot know what's happening. So.
Right. So this is documentation for your system, among other things, which is useful. The other thing I would say is,
I would say if you have 2 teams, you probably should enable this feature.
Even if you just have a smallish number of services, for the specialized use cases of ingress and egress, this provides you more control, and you're probably going to want to use it.
Can I ask a question quickly? Going back to the consumer provider thing, is it still going to be possible in this for a consumer to do fault injection? So as a consumer, I want to test how I respond to latency by this provider. I want to add this fault injection.
So today, right, all the destination rule stuff is attached by the service producer, and we explicitly are retaining that semantic. Now, the one thing that this pattern of namespace ownership would allow for is we could, in theory, though I'm not currently recommending it because we haven't validated that it makes sense, to allow the consumer to override destination rules for the services.
Fault injection is actually a virtual service. So yes, is the answer. Is you could in your local namespace create a virtual service.
No, that's valid.
The problem is
you lose
the destination is you're going to overwrite the destinations. You're not going to actually do path-based routing or anything like that.
So the problem is if you cannot easily override because if you have a traffic split or other configurations that are
exactly
it's dangerous to override.
It's dangerous to override the virtual service. If we moved the fault injection into a different resource, it may make sense. Or if we could just merge, that's a kind of case of
so fault injection is one of the things we've debated moving down into destination rule, and there's been arguments on either side about being attached to routing or not.
Destination rule is more important to merge because you may want to set different timeouts, because again, you may set default timeout 10 seconds, but if your service requires quick response, You want to override 1 second timeout.
Yeah, precisely. Like we've known for a while now that there's a split of producer concerned things and consumer concerned things in virtual service, right? Like things like deadlines.
Yeah.
Right.
And this doesn't change the calculus about any of that, right?
Exactly. This has not changed.
Yeah, this is not changing that.
No, but we may at some point select a set of consumer configurations and say that for those we have a different merging or override.
Right. So things that are possible, Liam, right? You can obviously go and say, okay, I'm going to take the virtual service defined by the producer, copy it into my namespace, not import it. The other one,
but maintenance is
right? It's a pain in the ass, right? So you're obviously only willing to do this if you're willing to bear pretty high configuration costs to test out the thing you're trying to test. But you at least have the ability to do it.
And in future version, we'll obviously have some better ways to do it.
Assuming you have permission to read virtual services in a different namespace.
Good point.
Right, which you may not even be able to see that configuration at all.
Yeah,
right,
no. We need to address this merging at some point.
Yeah, the other thing that. All right. The other thing I mentioned is that this is also can be occlusion for discovery if you want it.
Yeah, and to be clear, this is part of the reason that I brought up some of the merging stuff earlier, because this all gets very complicated, right? And that's why I think it needs to be very clear where we do the merging and what's and we have a very clear story about how it works.
Yeah.
And I think we do today with this scheme, but we just need to be careful as we add more.
Rather than dealing with all of these merging concerns, have you considered separating the attributes of these resources so that they align with the personas who actually want to configure them?
So at the resource granularity, we've tried to do that. Right. Obviously, things like virtual service, right, which contain many rules, right? They're basically ordered lists of rules that get implemented, which is the same thing as logically true for RBAC policy. Merging still has to occur between those groups of rules, right? So, and we didn't provide control over that. So yes, we are thinking about which roles are going to own which resources, but we're also somewhat constrained by, what the current idioms are for resource edit and resource access control in Kubernetes and elsewhere, right? We still expect there to be a unit of edit, which is aligned with a role, right? And I expect that there is a network namespace admin who's going to create, update, and delete this resource, who is responsible for basically the definition of the network within that namespace.
But if the service provider is modifying some attributes and the service consumer is modifying other attributes, and you can identify the boundary there, then you don't have more than one role modifying the same attributes, and you don't have to do a merge.
Right. So, well,
unfortunately, there are some attributes that both a consumer and a producer might legitimately want to mess with. Like routing is basically there are a lot of examples.
Yeah, timeouts are the clear example, right? Mm-hmm. So, like Shannon, to your point, I think your point is correct. Right now, are the actual contents of our resources split configuration that different people care about? And to Louis' point, right, we've talked about moving some of that stuff out and into other documents. Like, yes, we know that that's a problem in our config today, but it's worth talking about to this discussion, right? In some sense.
And can be addressed by a smart merge policy. I mean, if we override policy. So if we say that you can override fault injection and timeouts and nothing else, it's a solution.
I just don't know why fault injection is a concern of the producer at all.
Exactly. It's not, but today we encode that it is, and that's incorrect. We all agree there.
Yeah.
Right, but yeah, so I think there's what are the attachment points of fault injection and what are the valid faults you might want to use? And that might actually be more of a producer concern because they understand the canonical error modes of their service. And then are they on or not? Right, that might be a way of dividing up those roles, but we haven't gone through in detail on that particular use case, and that is the major remaining tension between the producer and consumer.
But that behavior should be transparent regardless of network scoping, hopefully.
All right, so the other way to do it, as Zach mentioned, is say, look, we'll try and move more into destination role, and then have a very specific resource that consumers can use that is designed for overrides of those behaviors. The problem is that resource is going to look a lot like virtual service because it's going to match based on routes. And so how much duplicate definition has the consumer now done? And would we be better off just telling them, go create a duplicate of virtual service and override what you want to override? And don't import the producer's one.
Or to Costin's point, do we support some sort of like limited merging of like just those fields or that kind of thing, right?
Right, which would also look like virtual service.
Exactly.
So is that distinction, is there enough incremental value in providing that kind of fine-grained override versus just telling them to go create a copy?
Yeah.
Well,
I think the answer there is probably not in the short term.
If they have read permission, as mentioned earlier.
If you don't know what you're talking to.
Well, Google APIs, you may want to
right, well,
inject Google
so
APIs.
one other way is to do virtual service delegation, right? Where I create my own virtual service and I have my own routing rules, and the destinations of all the routing rules are the other virtual service because it's a black box to you anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, to override it, I shouldn't need to read what the virtual service configuration that the producer has done.
And
all I care about is the URL and the port.
And I would say this is also important for external services as well. So again, Google APIs example is that you may want to fault inject into Google APIs, which doesn't have any virtual service yet.
Right, so we have talked about providing virtual service delegation, which at runtime is really virtual service composition, but to the consumer, it would look like delegation.
Mm-hmm.
And it would allow you to do those kinds of overrides, but it would look like virtual service. So like, I'm happy to take that discussion up. I think it's just incremental.
In a few months after we
we can go write a proposal about it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's blocking because while people are complaining about timeouts, they're not on fire about it.
They're not on fire, and we'll get more feedback as more people adopt Istio.
Okay. So we've hit on a couple of interesting topics. The other one, just so people understand, is while it's not a pressing concern today for some customers, we could, in theory, use this declaration to limit the DNS discoverability of the network, right?
Well,
So
what do you mean?
So if I run code in a namespace that is subject to this scope, and I try to resolve a host name that is not imported, I don't get anything.
I guess my question is more, today we don't do anything with DNS. So
yes, I'm just pointing out that this is a possibility. This is not a short-term deliverable.
Gotcha.
Yeah, we are doing something. Sriram
is doing something.
Oh, I'm very well aware, but I've been playing. I use it
for the DNS thing, right? That is just only for that global thing, and I think we have to change Kubernetes DNS in order for this thing to not be.
Sure, yeah, but just
exactly.
You can override the Kubernetes DNS. You can intercept DNS. You can do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, there's lots we can do. I think the question here is, are we going to end up in a situation, I mean, maybe Shannon, this is a question for you, where constraints on DNS discoverability is an important feature?
Yeah, maybe a way of framing this is when we first started looking at Istio a year and a half ago, the first thing we noticed was that there was no default denial policy. There was no sharding of the config in the sidecars, and that there was no way to remove the host name from discoverability as a result. I think of those three, I mentioned them in order of importance.
Okay.
The sharding and scalability is the most important. The sharding of configuration, I think, is synonymous there. But the discoverability and DNS resolution is less important.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the scenario we are thinking using about this is, so you guys probably remember we wrote a proposal about in a multi-cluster environment, you don't expose everything to the other cluster. So one of the scenario we were thinking is I'm sorry, yes, the mesh federation. So one of the scenario we're thinking is on that remote cluster, you could use this scoping and DNS scoping to actually control. Maybe you have 10 services, you only want 1 or 2 services to be exposed to the other cluster through mesh federation. So that could be the scenario going after. Do you
like,
guys think that makes sense?
I think I mean, what I would do for this case is to treat the namespaces as distinct. So even if they are called book info in both namespaces, we could do some, if you want the cluster book info namespace to be different and expose other things, we could qualify it with the cluster. So be cluster A/book info _ book.
Well, I mean, I think there are use cases where they are still the same semantically, but they have different visibility horizons because of regulatory constraints.
Yeah. So yeah, to your point, Louis, I think
locality-based.
Well, it's more than locality-based routing, right? So like, I think to your point, I think what you're getting at, Louis, is we want applications to have basically the same view of the world as the sidecar that's in front of them. Because that's really what this DNS visibility bit is.
Right.
And I totally agree with that. I think that that's exactly the right path that we should pursue.
So the other, because we're running out of time, so we're obviously not shipping that, but it's something that can be on the table, and this would play a part in that. The other thing was the traffic ownership RFE, which I pinged you about, Niraj. Obviously, this proposal, right, gives, because we essentially isolate namespaces, and namespaces can act independently or they can collaborate. Do we need the other thing? Right, because the use cases for the traffic ownership stuff were really around giving gateway owners, particularly for ingress, the ability to delegate trust around hostname or other networking aspects to other namespace owners so that their config would impact the behavior of an ingress. Well, now we have that behavior in this API. Right, I have the ability to delegate trust or to not.
By importing?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think importing is just another way of delegating. So I do agree. I think this API handles the things that traffic ownership and delegation was trying to do in a combined way. It might be just doing too many things. So we have to see when users start configuring it, if it's easy for them to understand and configure. But I agree, it handles those scenarios.
I am somewhat concerned about the wholesale import of all rules in another namespace. Currently, the workflows that
I think he's not expanded the API enough, but I mean, when I was going to write this up, I was actually going to add, like, under namespace, you will have the host to import, the virtual services to import, the destination rules to import by their names.
So I think
that
that's,
you still have the ability to import specific things.
Right, but then they're not black box Sriram, right?
Yeah, that's too much. I would prefer
not all mandatory if you wanted to, but it's otherwise by default everything gets imported. But if you specify, you get the ability to import only a specific virtual service. I mean, we are specifying like by a host, by a port, and so on. So you could always add the same facility for the
right, but then you'll end up in situations where people just rename the virtual service but give it the same host name.
Yeah, I would prefer, like if we were going to do that kind of stuff, I would rather be a producer-focused model where you export out of a namespace, and when I import the namespace, I receive the things that it exported.
I don't think I understand. So if we have a namespace with just 20 virtual services, and just like the way we provide a selection for, like, I only want Wikipedia host from this namespace, and only on port 443, we could also provide a means by which saying I only want to import this specific virtual service from this namespace.
But the whole point is that I don't own the namespace, so I don't know what's in it. I may not even have visibility to be able to list the API objects that are in that namespace.
Another issue I have with it is that the consumer shouldn't even know what namespace the service is in.
We want to maintain the black box property of the network.
The user experience seems clunky because the consumer shouldn't know anything about the namespace. They should only know about the host.
I agree with Shannon.
Then we should always stick to only wildcard hosts and fully qualified domain name for resources if need be, but not namespaces. But then that's different.
I mean, yeah, the bigger problem in our config is that we've made it host centric, but we haven't actually created host as an object to ACL or to be the key for this config, right?
I also find it quite confusing that host refers to a service instead of referring to the service.
And traffic ownership was the attempt to make hosts like a resource where you can do ACLs, right? So It is the producer-oriented alternative. Yeah.
But I think the premise that host and namespaces are completely decoupled. In the end, the owner of the host is the person who has the certificate and controls the DNS. That's a real owner of a particular domain name.
Right, but
Shannon is actually saying that's not valid is that when I said we can import specific virtual services and destination rules on namespace, you said that is like I might as well go to a producer model where I decide what to export and others will just simply import the whole thing. But Shannon is pointing out that the fact that I have to know namespace foo has a host called bar is itself a bad user experience because I don't.
Well, no, sure. Be careful. In the API, you don't have to know that, right? But remember, there's two things happening, right? Namespace represents the administrative unit. So if I want to import host, I also want to know who I'm importing it from because that's the delegation of trust.
Why?
Because it's a tenant.
Because it's tenancy, right?
Yeah.
I'm a big enterprise. I'm going to say the sales namespace is allowed to define sales.mycompany.com, right? That's owned by a person, and the only administrative unit that's associated with people, right, as controllers of those things are namespaces.
I recognize that there's ownership of a host name or URL, and whether that's first come first serve or you want to build something more complicated like a namespace owns it is sort of irrelevant. What the problem is that from the consumer's perspective, I shouldn't care who owns it. All I care about is that my application wants to make a request out to a URL.
No. So that's not quite true, right? In the delegation of virtual host model, I have to care who owns it because they are part of the service I'm exposing.
I think maybe we're mixing what the actual desired user experience and use cases are with limitations of a current implementation.
Well, no, I'm being very careful here, right? Virtual host delegation, right? Which is the thing we care about, because the service stuff is well covered already, right? Where you don't have to know, right? The network name is the black box, and that's all that you consume. But for virtual host, where I'm dividing up portions of a network namespace at a more granular level, right, and delegating ownership of that to another organizational unit, because I trust them.
Can we use examples? For example, do you mean Path Products is owned by one namespace and Pact Support is owned by another?
Yes.
Right. That's fine. It still doesn't change the point that the consumer doesn't care who owns it.
Yeah. So Shannon, I guess
they do care because they're the ones who did the delegation.
I
don't know what delegation you're referring to.
So I own a gateway resource, right? I own mycompany.com. And I say /sales is owned by the /sales namespace and /products is owned by the /products namespace. I clearly cared because I did that delegation.
The consumer does not own the gateway.
Which consumer?
Which consumer?
The owner of the gateway, consumer as a gateway, or sales department that's implementing the sales feature?
No, let's talk about service A calling service B. Service A is the consumer. Service B is the producer. Service A only cares about the URL of service B, and neither of them own the gateway.
Okay, then we're talking about different consumers, right? In this model, right, which is namespace-based delegation, I, the owner of a gateway, I'm a consumer of another namespace.
I think I know what you're talking about.
I'm so confused.
So can I try to answer your question? I think right now what we are doing is we are calling foo.product page or foo.sales because the names in Kubernetes have the namespace built in. You are saying that you may want to call services in Kubernetes using a different naming scheme.
No, he's saying
I don't care about Kubernetes at all. So all I care about is applications calling URLs.
Yeah. So the point is right now in the API that's being proposed, we are saying we want to encode this notion of namespace. Shannon, to address part of your concern, the API doesn't take just a host name, right? So you can import strictly a host with no namespace or anything like that, and you don't have to care who's provisioning that configuration. Louis is saying we can go one step further, and we can import host and a namespace. We can say, I want this host, and I want it to be from this administrative domain. That's also a valid use case, and we want to be able to satisfy both, where a user doesn't have to care who's producing the config. I just want a host name, and that works under the proposed API. We would like to be able to go further and say, I want this host name administered by this entity, and we can also say that with the API.
Okay. Can you help me understand why? Why you want to? Can you give me an example of the use case for that second, more prescriptive or declaring the namespace?
So is it possible a given host can be provided by multiple namespace, and I only want to use from one of the namespace?
So if they're hard divided tenancy units, right, then why is my choice of a name in my tenancy unit allowed to impact your choice of your name in another tenancy unit?
I think he's coming from the fact that DNS is a shared resource across the organization, so it's a first come first serve basis.
Right,
so you go and grab
talking about DNS, Shriram.
No, we're not. But I'm saying in reality, if you go grab a name, then that person has the name, so the chances of name collision does not exist. So in that point of view, he's asking how does two namespaces have same host name?
Exactly. I don't see a scenario where two teams could have the same host name.
Well, so the one that we're extremely well aware of is for egress, right? Where I, as the business owner, want all traffic to go out through some egress middle proxy. So there will be a namespace owner who's going to define the name, let's say facebook.com, and they're going to define that name as pointing to that middle proxy. There's going to be another namespace owner who's going to define the name facebook.com, and it's going to point it to the external entry, right? A split horizon. Right, and I'm doing it deliberately because I want egress gateway access control management. Right, that is a well understood use case. We run into it all the time. I have two different declarations for the same name.
And
interesting. In Cloud Foundry, you wouldn't allow people to egress bypassing the egress proxy. I mean, in the customers we work with, if you have a use case for controlling egress to a sensitive resource or even to facebook.com, you're going to do so globally.
Sure, but we run into companies, right, in a more ad hoc manner where they mix and match. Right, we cannot deny the other use case either.
And you may have multiple egress gateways. You don't have a single egress gateway. Different teams may go to different egress gateways with different, different priorities and everything else.
Or different locality effect.
Different locality, different priorities, everything else, yeah.
Right, so in that situation, we clearly have two different definitions of the same host name, right? And their namespace scoped because the egress gateway runs in a namespace, and it has visibility to the ones that are pointing externally, and everybody else only has visibility to the ones that point at the egress gateway.
So I think egress makes sense to me because the traffic management rules are enforced on the client side, in that case, by the consumer, not by the producer. 1 second, thank you.
For ingress, I think maybe we can find something.
I got to drop. Sorry.
Oh,
yeah, no worries.
I mean, when we are doing path-based routing, where the host name is shared, but based on paths, we are delegating to different teams in different namespaces. We have the same issue, right? The host name will be shared across different namespaces.
But that's for ingress. That's the opposite direction.
Well, it can happen internally too, right? Let's not pretend.
A bit less likely. I mean, for ingress.
Actually, no. In big companies, if you see a moderate amount, that's why API gateways are actually sold more for internal use cases than for external use cases.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was saying. So I think just pinning this to egress is not the right model.
No, I'm just saying egress is one example. Yes. It's a very clear one of a split horizon DNS, right? There are plenty of other examples within enterprise of people doing split horizon, right? Which is what this is representing. Okay.
So Louis, I have another question, hopefully quick. So in this example of your gateway, you said import point of sale and for the namespace and the host. Now, when I specify a network scope, do you expect the host and namespace already pre-exist, or that could be to be determined as long as it's going to be exist down the road?
Evaluate the time of like creating the sidecar configuration. It's like evaluate at runtime. It does not have to pre-exist. You can declare it and then it doesn't matter at all. If it doesn't exist, we won't, nothing happens. If it exists, then they're great.
Updates have to work, right? If we have wildcards, then anything that comes into existence that matches the wildcard must be delivered.
Okay, so there's no requirement of import has to be there when you actually declare. Okay, that's cool. Because you could map out like 10 teams, 10 services before they even exist or deploy.
Yeah, so I've had feedback. Go down the bottom of the document, there's a section on bike shedding around the nomenclature. One of the negative feedbacks around import is that it feels static.
Yeah, that's the reason why I asked.
There's plenty of other bike shedding around the naming stuff. One of the things I wanted to do was to set a deadline for people to provide bike shedding feedback.
But then it's not a good bike shed.
The bike shed is scheduled for destruction tomorrow at 5 p.m. How about that?
And then Louis will pick whatever name he wanted in the first place, and
Exactly.
Can we talk in detail about how it's going to be destroyed, Louis?
It was posted at the Vogon conference center. What is the City Hall several years back?
Yes, exactly.
All right.
Only 50 layers away.
So do you plan to take this in the config working group also for review, or should we? So shall we bike shed discuss a bit more next week, what do?
So one thing I'm very careful. I was very careful in this doc to talk about what could and could not be delivered incrementally. I think we can reasonably deliver this feature without global default.
Yeah.
As long as we have the flag which says it's either import everything or import nothing by default.
Yeah. The global default is a very, very small incremental thing. I mean, it's
right. Yes. No. I'm not saying
added after.
Yeah. So I'm not saying it's not, and if it happens to make it in the same release, great. I'm just saying that they can be separated.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to get hung up on that. There doesn't seem to be much discord about virtual service import and export and service import. Sorry, public private is also a natural scoping or thing, which is even more coarse grained, but very, very producer oriented and somewhat obvious. No one seemed to have any negative feedback about that. So that I think that's baked in. So Neeraj, I think you wanted to spend a little bit more time with it to see how you felt about it. We didn't entirely come to a conclusion on traffic ownership and whether we did or did not need something more fine-grained, but at least this allows us to make progress and get some user feedback about whether this is or is not fine-grained enough.
Good.
And it provides a lot of control. The one thing this clearly does is it gives you a lot of control. It also didn't seem like there was much discord around how this impacted virtual service merging. It made it much clearer, which is a good thing. Was there any other outstanding issue that I haven't really addressed?
So in the first version that we are trying to implement, are we going to just import namespace and host names, or also other resources like virtual services and
So if you import a host name, you're importing a virtual service.
Yep.
And I have a PR in progress that is implementing the isolation, and I think that can go first because, again, it allows us to see how it works.
Isolation or pruning?
You have
pruning.
Isolation is like isolation because it's.
I would suggest we do it the proper way where we just like have the API and then import it, because it's actually very simple to implement this, and it's just a matter of like scoping.
Sure, but really that's part of the API. I mean, importing only from your own namespace is part of the API, and then second part is you can import stuff. So you see on your own namespace is the first step, and then you can see additional stuff is the second step.
Today is based on annotations, like more annotations.
No, I remove annotation. Annotation, I'll remove them from the PR for sure.
Okay. Anyway, so there's obviously going to be a bunch of implementation going on.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one concern that did just spring to mind, Louis, with namespace-wide imports. What if I define a virtual service that overrides some other host name, and somebody imports my entire namespace? So they get kind of some unintended virtual service that I defined for myself, but because they import the entire namespace, it comes along and it gets merged with the real virtual service for that host name.
Well, that's what you chose to do, right?
No, I didn't choose that. They authored.
Right. So no, you chose to use a wildcard.
No, if I import the namespace, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's a wildcard, right? You're importing every host in the namespace. Yeah.
You get what you ask for.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair. We're going to get some unintended outages.
I think we're going to probably recommend to a lot of people that they explicitly import host and namespace pairs if they want exact control.
My general argument here is this is why I think a producer-oriented model is nice, because
wait,
those style issues, but
we still have the public, no?
Yes, they can still, yeah, but exact point is the accidental model, right? The accidental misconfiguration, right?
Yeah. Like, because I just import star from a namespace, and then somebody in that namespace authors a virtual service, and now I'm screwed.
And make it public.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so the one thing I did say,
that we had public.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have your own virtual service and you import somebody else, at least yours is pre-pended.
Very true.
So
but if I import two, like if I import
then it gets a bit funky, right?
Right. So that's just something to be aware of.
Be careful with your imports. We're going to have to write some documentation telling people to be careful with their imports, which we're going to have to do anyway.
Yep.
Anyway, can also validate if you have two public names exported and import. I mean, public and imported at the same time. That's a validation that can be done.
Yep. Anyway, sorry, that was just one thing that came to mind as I was just reviewing.
Yeah. Anyway. No, there are definitely, if you're importing stuff and you don't know why you're importing, danger.
Yep.
Another thing traffic ownership was handling is trying to restrict the path that entity can use, like a virtual service or anything. Is this document going to address that later?
No. Right. So the thing that I'm not sure if it is. And the reason why I'm not sure if it is if we have delegation of trust between administrative domains, right, which is saying gateway owner in namespace A have delegated to namespace B, C, and D, and namespace B goes rogue, I can take namespace B out by not importing them anymore.
But if you know that
the fat finger potential there is so big, though. That's not really a good enough answer, right? So, like, we've seen these outages. Like, I don't totally buy that.
Well, so what we've seen with the companies that are doing massive merges, right? What they end up is, it's not that namespace B went rogue, right?
It's they fat fingered something, right? They did something and didn't.
Right. It's one thing
they
can't override the behavior of the importing namespace, right? So they don't get that to be that destructive.
True.
So they only get to interfere with one of the other namespaces.
True. I think Niraj was getting at the path-based case where you do have to trust that if I import from B, C, and D, that they correctly coordinate to split up the path.
Yeah. So I think what would be more interesting in this context is, now that we have delegation of ownership, we could look at virtual service delegation as a means of solving the segmentation of path problem, which was the other original proposal.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that combination would now make more sense.
At the same time, having at some point we can migrate to URLs instead of simply host names, and that will allow us.
Well, then it's going to start looking like virtual service again, right? This is the problem with virtual service. Anything that tries to put constraints on what virtual service can do looks like virtual service.
And that's what delegation of virtual service means.
At least we are consistent.
No, but if we had delegation of virtual service, you already have the API.
Yeah.
You
that is a much more, and it's homogeneous, right? It's in my mind desirable for that property alone.
Yep. Okay.
We have the same API at every level.
Yep.
Depends.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Cool.
I think we can probably continue next week because it's already 18 minutes over.
Yeah.
So thanks for participating, and see you in a week, really. So.
Next week.
Well, I just want to make sure.
Actually, no, it's
next week is Thanksgiving. Yeah.
Thanksgiving then. Yeah. Maybe in 2 weeks.
Well, so I'd like to get this resolved sooner. It didn't sound like, other than Niraj, who wants to spend a bit more time with it, it didn't sound like there were strenuous objections.
No, I think this is fine.
Well, many people left already, so but
I think we all generally agree, right?
Okay.
I think it's like I haven't heard like big arguments against it. That's like I think more of the question were about clarification questions rather than arguments against. So
right.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.